Exposure to lead can come with a whole range of health problems, both mental and physical. And when you think lead poisoning, it sounds like an issue that was solved decades ago. But Sean, the truth is, it's still around.
Yeah, right now, at least 4 million households have children that are being exposed to high levels of lead. And about 500,000 kids in the U.S. under 5 are being exposed to dangerous amounts of lead.
In fact, lead poisoning is happening right here on Delmarva. In Maryland, there were 343 cases in the year 2012. In Delaware, there were 44 cases in 2011. And in Virginia, there were 279 cases in the year 2011. Now, lead poisoning can strike with little to no warning, so you have to know what to look for. Well, one family knows that all too well. Lead poisoning is certainly something they never thought would change the life of their toddler, Antonio.
You are there to protect your child, but here it is. You let something slip through you.
Any parent can understand Nathaniel Stone's hurt and concern.
The hurt in you because you sin your... Lord have mercy. Thank you, Jesus. It hurts you to see your child in this condition.
His 2-year-old, Antonio, suffers from hearing loss. Sometimes he has to wear hearing aids. The culprit? Peeling chipped paint. About a year ago, his father found Antonio eating paint chips at their old apartment. He was tested and diagnosed with hearing loss because of lead-based paint. Lead paint has been banned for decades, but remains in homes built before 1978.
We do see a number of lead-poisoned children with hearing loss, and unfortunately that was the case with Mr. Stone's child.
Julie Twichell leads a lead poisoning prevention program. The program helped Stone find a new apartment, an old unit that was completely remodeled, making it lead-free. Even a lead tester today couldn't detect any lead-based paint. But Twichell says 80% of some county homes have some form of lead-based paint.
If you've painted in the last, 20 years, there's probably a surface layer that's not lead, but those layers underneath are.
Nathaniel's town is one of many suing 5 specific paint companies. They claim the companies knew they were selling harmful products. The industry argues that it never deliberately sold harmful product to consumers and that the old paint is no longer a significant public health risk. But Twichell says little Antonio is proof otherwise.
And Antonio's story is pretty hard to hear, and according to the National Institute of Health, along with hearing loss, exposure to lead can also cause behavioral issues or attention problems in children, possible failure in school, or even a reduced IQ. Some children see kidney damage at a young age, and many have reported stunted growth. Young children are also suffering from anemia, difficulty sleeping, and even reduced sensation or motor skills. Also linked to lead exposure, violence. Now, we've heard about high crime rates in cities like Baltimore, Philadelphia, Chicago, and New Orleans. And while some major city crime rates are finally lowering, one in particular has not. But researchers may have pinpointed the source of the problem.
When Sarah Hess looks at her daughter Josie, she sees a healthy, happy child.
She's a really, really smart little girl. And, everybody tells me not to worry.
But she does worry about an element that's all around them. A test from her doctor found that Josie had acute lead poisoning, a potentially damaging diagnosis for a child that can affect how pathways in the brain develop. The Hess family immediately began lead remediation on their home.
During that time, we started spending a lot more time at playgrounds and out of doors, trying to stay out of houses, not realizing that the playgrounds that we were going to had higher lead levels than our house.
Josie's lead levels in her blood shot up from the initial diagnosis of 8.8 micrograms to 18, leading Hess to seek out as much information as she could about lead in the soil.
It really felt tragic. It felt like a tragedy because we had this beautiful daughter who seemed perfect in every way, and people were telling us that her reading comprehension would never be as good.
When kids come to a playground like this one, where is the lead danger?
The danger is right on the surface, and within bare areas especially.
Dr. Howard Mielke is a Tulane University researcher who has spent his career studying lead contamination in soil across the city. While much of the attention is focused on lead-based paint from years past, Dr. Mielke places the blame squarely on something else: Decades of using lead-based gasoline in cars starting in the 1950s until leaded gas was permanently banned in 1996.
It's hard for people to appreciate how much lead entered into the city through just use of leaded gasoline.
Consider this. Each one of these packets contains 1 gram of sweetener. A gallon of leaded gas would release about 1 gram of lead into the air. But many older cars had about 20 gallons in a tank of gas. That means 20 grams of lead were released into the air every time those cars went through a tank of gas.
That's one car. You think of the hundreds or thousands of cars that are moving around, and you can start understanding the quantities that we're talking about.
Using census tracts as a foundation, Dr. Mielke and his team have collected more than 10,000 samples of soil from neighborhoods across New Orleans. The most recent test included 5,500 samples. Dr. Mielke recently published a paper about those results. And when they mapped out their lead findings, they discovered a startling correlation.
The high lead areas of the city are the areas that you tend to have the highest crime. And that's, of course, the current situation.
Lead in the bloodstream can lead to behavioral problems in children. It affects the way synapses develop in a child's brain, especially the part of the brain that oversees impulse control. But not everyone is convinced about a direct connection between lead and violent crime.
Everybody wants a murder, get well pill.
Criminologist Peter Scharf says the roots of violent crime run deep.
My own view is it's a very complex process, and lead may be a part, but really you have to look at it in comparison with other hypotheses, economic changes, cultural changes, gun laws in some cases.
And lead just is a contributor, and it seems to be a significant contributor.
Researchers say the effects of lead poisoning have a 20-year lag time, meaning leaded gas that was used in the 50s could explain the rise in violent crime in the 70s. It works the other way, too. As leaded gas was phased out in the early 90s, it could explain why there's been a drop in violent crime recently in major cities, but not necessarily here in New Orleans.
It's a more soiled city, or it has more open areas that are yard-oriented type of city.
Meaning the lead stubbornly stays put. It does not break down. The solution? Containment and replacing soil, much like what the city did 2 years ago when it found high levels of lead at city playgrounds. But Dr. Mielke says lead contamination should be considered a national issue.
Well, one of our problems at the federal level is that we have a Clean Air Act, we have a Clean Water Act, we don't have a Clean Soil Act.
Sarah Hess agrees, trying to keep her children's lead exposure to a minimum.
We push down the soap into our hand and we rub and scrub.
But in the meantime, she'll keep a close eye on Josie.
Josie seems fine, but we talk about empathy every day. And we do that because of her exposure, because we need to counteract it.
Counteracting what's become an embedded part of the environment all around us.
A study by Guttmacher Institute suggests that exposure to lead does in fact show a rise in both crime and teen pregnancy, but fortunately both of those statistics are going down.
I think it's interesting that they can connect it to the synapses in our brain that lead to compulsive acts. It all seems to make sense.
Yeah.
How about that? Well, lead can be found in even the most unsuspecting places, like your family's dinner plate. It turns out people were finding high lead levels in imported rice. Certain rices brought in from Asia, Europe, and South America showed up to 60 times the allowable levels for young children.
And although there is no safe level of lead, many parents were alarmed by these numbers. The study done back in 2013 found that rice imported from Taiwan and China had the highest levels, while samples from the Czech Republic, Italy, India, and Thailand were lower. But they also caused alarm.
Now, the results were preliminary, so now researchers are extensively reviewing their findings. When you know what to look for and you're taking the proper precautions, lead poisoning is 100% preventable. Unfortunately, thousands of kids are still getting sick. Testing your children and your home for lead really is the difference between life and death. In today's Angie's List report, we learn how to keep your family protected.
Lead paint lurks in 40% of the nation's homes, about 36 million homes across the U.S. Any amount, even the tiniest bit on the tip of your finger, will have an impact on a child.
Kids under the age of 6 are especially vulnerable to lead poisoning, which can severely affect physical and mental development. They don't have to eat or chew lead-based paint chips to be poisoned. Most kids are poisoned when they breathe in or swallow lead dust.
Especially if you live in a home that's built before 1978, you probably have older windows. So every time you open those windows and close them, you might not see it, but it's happening inside those little crevices of the window.
Dangerous amounts of lead dust can also be created when lead-based paint is disturbed during renovation, repair, or painting jobs. That's why federal law requires any contractor who disturbs lead paint to be EPA certified and follow strict work practices to prevent contamination.
For example, they should be using HEPA filters. They should use plastic sheeting to completely seal off the area. They should also wear protective foot cover, protective clothing. If you see any signs that make you uncomfortable, you should stop the work immediately.
In a recent sting, Angie's List called 150 renovation contractors and questioned them about lead-safe practices. Nearly 11% offered bad advice and nearly 32% admitted they did not have the required EPA lead safety certification.
Angie's List has been a champion of safe lead practices for many, many years and continue to work to raise the awareness about lead paint poisoning. Also, we're denoting on company records if they're working on houses before 1978 if they don't have proper certification.
If you're planning a remodeling project, Angie's List says arm yourself with information and verify your contractor has the proper training.
Even if you live in a newer house, you should always be concerned about where your children visit. Is grandma's house built before 1978? Other family members, even a daycare? Because in those scenarios, you want to be sure that those places are safe as well, because it takes a small amount of lead for a child to get lead poisoning.
There's no cure for it, and so once you're poisoned, it's for life.
Now, only a blood test can confirm lead poisoning, but if you have concerns about lead exposure, push your child's doctor to do an evaluation. And experts say if your house was built before 1978, you should assume the paint has lead in it unless tests show otherwise.
Well, there are some signs that experts have said you can look for. Some early signs of lead exposure include developmental delays and learning difficulties in children. Maybe they're not hitting those milestones as they should be. You'll also see a loss of appetite or weight loss, sluggish behavior. They may be tired all the time or irritable. They may experience some abdominal pain, anything from mild to severe. Vomiting and hearing loss is a big one to look out for. Another thing to keep an eye out for, the men and women we have for you in this week's Most Wanted Monday. We'll have a new batch next.
Plus, some inventors who are shedding light on a renewable energy source. They're the guys behind the glow-in-the-dark plant. What they say is inspiring people to look to the future. Delmarva Life, we'll be right back.